Trail County, North Dakota, March 1978. The frost was still 2 feet deep in the black earth, but the sun, for the first time in months, held a hint of warmth instead of just light. It was this weak promise of spring that had Eero Kalunki, all 68 years of him, out on his newly acquired 10 acres, wrestling with squares of prairie sod. He wasn't plowing it or seeding it. He was stacking it meticulously on the curved steel roof of the war-surplus Quonset hut he'd bought for $900. Inside the Hillsboro Livestock Auction Cafe, the air was thick with the smell of coffee, fried sausage, and damp wool. Burton Haviland, the grain elevator's lead carpenter, watched Eero's slow progress through the grimy window. He took a noisy sip of his coffee and nudged Dale Jorgensen, another carpenter from the co-op. "Get a load of the fin," Burton said, his voice a low rumble of amusement. "Thinks he's building a bunker for the next war." Les Muller, a younger man who hung on Burton's every word, chuckled. "What in God's name is he doing? Planting a lawn up there?" "He's building himself a problem is what he is," Burton declared, setting his mug down with the finality of a judge's gavel. He'd spent 30 years fastening steel roofs to barns and machine sheds across the Red River Valley. He knew steel. You kept it clean. You kept it bare. You let the snow slide off. You didn't bury it under a foot of wet dirt. "That's 100 pounds a square foot easy once it's wet. He'll have that whole damn thing caved in on his head by the first real snow. The man's gone foolish in his old age." The men around the table nodded. They were men who understood the unforgiving physics of a Dakota winter. They respected hard work, but they had no patience for foolishness. And capping a perfectly good steel Quonset with a living roof of prairie sod seemed like the definition of foolishness. Every morning, as the sun rose, Eero Kalunki would pull on his boots, knock the frost from the laces, and walk the perimeter of his strange, half-buried home, checking the runoff. The mockery from the men at the auction cafe lasted through the spring and summer. The validation would take a little longer. What did this old Finnish beet hauler, a man who'd spent his life wrestling with the earth from the seat of a truck, understand about thermal mass, radiant heat, and the crushing power of wind that 3 of the best carpenters in the county had missed? This story isn't just about an old man and his strange roof. It's about a hidden knowledge carried across an ocean and half a continent that solved a problem most people didn't even know how to name. I promise you, by the end of this, you'll understand the profound difference between simple insulation and true thermal mass, and why sometimes the oldest ideas are the most revolutionary. So, stick around. And if you find yourself appreciating this kind of practical wisdom, consider subscribing to the channel. Let me know in the comments. Have you ever seen an idea mocked by experts that later proved to be genius? Eero Kalunki was not a carpenter. He was not an engineer, and after a lifetime of leasing land, he was only just now, in the twilight of his years, learning to be a farmer. For 42 seasons, Eero had been a beet hauler. His hands were shaped not by the delicate heft of a hammer, but by the cold iron of a steering wheel and the greasy levers of a hydraulic lift. His world had been one of weights and measures, of balancing a 20-ton load over a frozen axle, of understanding how pressure and gravity worked on a scale most men never considered. He knew what a cubic yard of wet earth weighed. He knew how the frost heaved the roads. He knew the deep, resonant hum of a diesel engine laboring against a headwind that could strip the paint from a tractor. He and his wife, Alma, had raised 2 children in a series of rented houses, always following the harvest. Their dream was simple: a small piece of land, a place where their roots could finally go deeper than a single season's crop. When he retired, they bought 10 acres of marginal land west of Hillsboro. Land too stony for sugar beets, too small for wheat, but just right for them. Their first winter on that land, in a second-hand travel trailer, was a brutal education. They had come to North Dakota from Minnesota, and before that, Eero's family was from the Karelian Isthmus in Finland, a place of deep snows and ancient forests. But nothing had prepared them for the sheer, relentless assault of a Dakota winter on open ground. The wind was not a visitor. It was a permanent, malevolent feature of the landscape. It found every seam in the trailer's aluminum skin, every crack in the window seals. They burned through propane at a terrifying rate, the little furnace roaring constantly but producing only a small circle of habitable warmth. Alma had to keep the bread dough under the blankets with her at night to get it to rise. They slept in layers of wool, their breath crystallizing in the air. The propane bills that first winter ate nearly a quarter of their savings. It was a cold that didn't just chill the body, it leached away hope. Lying in the dark, listening to the trailer's frame groan under the force of the wind, Eero remembered his grandfather's stories. He remembered the drawings the old man had made in a worn notebook, pictures of Turvikato, the turf-roofed houses of his homeland. They weren't log cabins in the American style. They were low, solid structures, often partially dug into a hillside, their roofs thick with layers of birch bark, clay, and living sod. His grandfather had called them earth houses. "The wind cannot bite what it cannot grab," the old man used to say. "The earth is a good blanket. It holds the summer sun in winter." Eero was a practical man. He wasn't given to flights of fancy, but as he tallied the cost of propane and felt the cold seeping into his bones, his grandfather's words felt less like folklore and more like a forgotten blueprint. He knew he couldn't afford to build a traditional house. He needed something cheap, strong, and fast. That spring, he saw the 1943 Quonset hut listed in a farm auction circular, $900. The curved shape, designed to shed bombs and shrapnel, was also inherently strong against wind and snow load. An idea, radical and deeply traditional at the same time, began to form in his mind. He would buy the steel shell of the new world and wrap it in the wisdom of the old. The failure of conventional buildings in Trail County wasn't due to poor craftsmanship. Burton Haviland and his crew were meticulous. They built sturdy, well-framed structures. Their machine sheds and barns were square, the seams were tight, and the roofs were expertly fastened. The problem wasn't the construction. The problem was the physics they were up against. A standard Quonset hut, like the ones that dotted the prairie, was a thermal nightmare. Its corrugated steel skin was, in scientific terms, a near-perfect thermal conductor. It had an R value, a measure of thermal resistance, of less than 1. For comparison, a single pane of glass is about R1. A simple wood frame wall is R12. The Quonset was essentially a metal tent. Whatever temperature it was outside, it was nearly the same temperature inside within minutes. In the summer, they were ovens. In the winter, they were cryotubes. The primary enemy was radiant heat loss. Heat naturally flows from a warm object to a cold one. Inside a heated Quonset, every surface, a tractor engine, a wood stove, a human body, was radiating thermal energy. This energy would travel through the air, strike the cold steel skin, and be instantly conducted to the outside world, lost forever. The bigger the temperature difference, the faster the heat fled. At 70 degrees inside and 0 degrees outside, the steel walls were a massive, silent heat vampire. The second enemy was wind. North Dakota's wind, sweeping unimpeded across hundreds of miles of frozen plains, was a force of nature. This constant flow of air over the steel skin was a process called forced convection, or more simply, wind chill. It continuously stripped away the thin boundary layer of slightly warmer air clinging to the outside of the building, dramatically accelerating the rate of heat loss. A 20-mile-per-hour wind at 0 degrees Fahrenheit has the same cooling effect on a surface as minus 22 degrees Fahrenheit still air. Burton's solution was to seal every crack, to caulk every seam, to stop the wind from getting in. He was fighting infiltration, but he couldn't stop the wind from scouring the heat from the outside. Neighbors experienced this every day. You could have a propane furnace blasting away, and still frost would form on the heads of the bolts on the inside of the hut. Each metal bolt was a tiny thermal bridge, a direct conduit for the cold. Condensation was a constant plague. Warm, moist air from breathing or cooking would hit the frigid steel ceiling and instantly condense into water droplets, which would then freeze into a fine layer of interior rime ice. When the temperature fluctuated, it would melt and rain down on everything inside. It was a miserable, damp, and ruinously expensive way to live. Burton Haviland saw the solution as more insulation on the inside, fiberglass bats framed out with 2x4s. It was a valid approach, but it was expensive, and it ate up valuable interior space. It treated the steel skin as the enemy to be covered. Eero Kalunki saw it differently. He wasn't going to fight the steel. He was going to use it as the foundation for something else entirely. The construction began in May. Eero, with Alma helping to hold bolts, assembled the Quonset on a simple 4-inch concrete slab he'd poured himself. It was a standard 40-foot-long hut, a familiar sight. The neighbors would slow their trucks as they passed, giving a friendly wave. It was what came next that turned waves into slow, confused stares. Eero didn't frame the interior. He didn't call the insulators. Instead, he drove his old beat truck to a stand of paper birch down by the river. For a week, he carefully peeled wide sheets of bark from dead or fallen trees. Where he couldn't find enough, he bought rolls of heavy tar paper from the co-op. He started at the bottom of the Quonset, laying the bark and paper directly against the steel, overlapping each layer like shingles, ensuring water would always be shed outwards. Burton Haviland drove by one afternoon, stopped his truck, and walked over, his face a mask of professional concern. "Eero, what are you doing?" Burton asked, his voice betraying no judgment yet. "That's just going to trap moisture against the steel. It'll rust out from under you in 5 years." "Vapor barrier," Eero said, not pausing in his work. He pointed to the overlapping seams. "Water runs down, stays out." Burton shook his head. "It's not how it's done." "Is how my grandfather did," Eero replied, and that was the end of the conversation. Next came the drainage layer. Eero hauled a dozen loads of coarse gravel and sand from a local pit. He laid a 4-inch layer of this mixture over the birch bark, carefully grading it so it was thicker at the base and thinner at the crown of the arch. This was slow, back-breaking work for a man of 68. He shoveled the gravel into 5-gallon buckets, carried them up a ladder, and gently spread the material, checking the depth with a small wooden dowel. Then came the first layer of sod. He cut the thick prairie sod into uniform 18 by 24-inch blocks. The real work was hauling them up the ladder. He'd manage one block at a time, his arms straining. He laid this first layer grass side down, directly onto the gravel bed. The dense, tangled root mass faced upward. This was the layer that baffled everyone. "He's got the damn thing upside down," Les Miller reported back at the cafe. "The grass is pointing the wrong way." This inverted layer of sod, packed tightly together, formed a spongy, absorbent medium. Its purpose was to hold moisture and provide a nutrient base for the layer above it. It was a technique straight from the old country. Finally, starting in late June, when the prairie grasses were in full vigor, he laid the top layer. These blocks were laid grass side up. He worked with the precision of a stonemason, fitting the blocks tightly together, filling any gaps with loose soil. By mid-July, the Quonset hut had vanished. In its place stood a long, green, living mound. like an ancient burial barrow dropped onto the Dakota plains. He had moved, by his own calculation, over 40 tons of earth onto his roof. Burton made one last visit. He walked around the structure, kicking at the base with the toe of his boot. "I'll give you this, Eero. It's a damned fortress. But that weight, that wet weight after a spring thaw, I'm telling you, it's going to buckle. The arch will hold a snow load because it's distributed, but a dead load of wet soil that can shift and settle? It's not designed for that." Eero was watering a dry patch with a hose. He looked at Burton, then at the roof, then back at Burton. He smiled a rare, small smile. "Soil is good blanket," he said again. Alma brought them both a glass of lemonade, and Burton, shaking his head, finally drove away. He had given his warning. He had done his duty as a concerned neighbor and a professional. Now all he could do was wait for winter to prove him right. The physics behind Eero's living roof was both simple and profound. It wasn't merely insulation, it was a complete thermal system. Burton Haviland thought in terms of R value, a static measurement of resistance to heat flow. Eero, guided by ancestral knowledge, had built a system that managed heat dynamically, using the principles of thermal mass. Let's start with what Burton understood: insulation. The 12 inches of soil and dense root matter were indeed a powerful insulator. The millions of tiny air pockets trapped within the soil structure dramatically slowed the process of conduction. While the steel skin had an R value of nearly 0, Eero's foot-thick blanket of earth likely had an R value of R15 to R20, comparable to a standard insulated wall. The layer of snow that would later accumulate on top would add another R1 for every inch, easily bringing the total to R30 or more in midwinter. This alone was a massive improvement, drastically reducing the heat lost through the roof. The wind that scoured heat from his neighbors' bare steel roofs had no effect on Eero's. The wind blew over the grass and snow, but it couldn't touch the steel skin buried a foot below. He had eliminated forced convection as a factor. But the real genius was the thermal mass. Thermal mass is an object's ability to store heat. A lightweight material like fiberglass insulation has high R value but very low thermal mass. A dense material like concrete, stone, or packed earth has high thermal mass. Throughout the day, even on a cold, clear winter day, the sun bombards the earth with solar radiation. Eero's dark, earthy roof absorbed this energy, and the 40 tons of soil slowly warmed up, storing thousands of BTUs of free solar heat. At night, when the temperature plummeted, the process reversed. As the interior of the hut tried to cool, the heat didn't just escape. It was met by the massive, slow-releasing warmth of the roof. The sod blanket was radiating gentle heat downward into the living space, buffering the temperature drop. The propane furnace didn't have to fight the full force of the minus 20 degrees Fahrenheit night. It only had to make up the small difference between the desired indoor temperature and the temperature of the slowly cooling thermal mass above. It turned the entire roof into a massive passive radiator. The layered design was also critical. The tar paper was the modern substitute for waterproof birch bark, preventing water from ever touching the steel. The gravel layer ensured that any excess water from heavy rain or snowmelt could drain away freely to the edges, preventing the soil from becoming a sodden, heavy bog. The inverted sod layer acted as a sponge and a foundation, while the top layer, with its living grasses, created a durable, erosion-resistant skin. The roots of the grasses would eventually grow down, stitching both layers together into a single, cohesive mat. Eero hadn't read a textbook on thermodynamics. He didn't know the R value or the specific heat capacity of soil. He just knew what his grandfather had taught him. The earth is a good blanket. It holds the heat. He had taken a principle born of a world of wood and stone and applied it perfectly to the steel of a new age. The first snows came in November, blanketing the county in white. Inside the green mound, Eero and Alma were comfortable. The propane furnace, which had roared day and night in their trailer, now cycled on and off with a quiet sigh. Alma kept a pot of parsley growing on the windowsill, something unthinkable the year before. The air inside was still and silent, the howling wind a distant rumor rather than an invading force. Vernon Reese, the delivery man for the Farmers Co-op propane, was the first outsider to notice something was amiss. He came to top off the Kelunky's 500-gallon tank in early December, expecting it to be at least half empty. He hooked up the hose, started the pump, and it clicked off in less than 2 minutes. He checked the gauge. The tank was still nearly full. "Got a leak, Eero?" Vernon asked, peering at the tank's fittings. "No leak," Eero said, stacking firewood. "Furnace broken?" "Furnace is fine." Vernon was stumped. He'd been delivering propane in Trail County for 15 years. He knew to the gallon what a building of that size should burn in a month like November. Eero's usage was less than half of what it should be. It made no sense. He made a note in his logbook and drove away, shaking his head. January was colder, with a week of sub-zero temperatures. The mockery at the auction cafe died down, replaced by the grim business of winter survival. Then, in the first week of February, the real test arrived. An Arctic clipper dropped out of Canada, preceded by a freezing rain that coated every surface, every tree branch, every power line, every roof, in a half-inch thick armor of clear ice. Then the temperature plunged. For 6 consecutive nights, the official reading at the Hillsborough grain elevator dropped below minus 25 degrees Fahrenheit, with winds gusting to 40 miles per hour. It was a brutal, killing cold. Livestock froze in unheated barns. Farmers worked in frantic shifts to keep water troughs from turning to solid blocks of ice. Burton Haviland was run ragged, responding to calls about collapsed porches and shattered windows. The extreme cold made steel brittle, and the weight of the ice was immense. Inside his own well-built workshop, with a heater roaring, he couldn't keep the frost from creeping across the inside of the metal walls. At the Kelunky place, life went on with a strange, quiet normalcy. The thick blanket of snow and sod over the ice-encased roof insulated them completely. Eero only had to run the furnace for an hour in the morning and an hour in the evening. The thermal mass of the roof did the rest, maintaining a steady temperature of 65 degrees inside. Alma baked rye bread, the smell filling the cozy, curved space. The most telling sign was on the ceiling. There was no frost. Not on the steel ribs, not on the bolt heads. The interior surface of the metal was cool to the touch, but not cold enough for condensation to freeze. They were living inside their blanket, protected from the Arctic siege outside. The snow on their roof did not melt in patches from escaping heat. It simply sat. A perfect layer of added insulation, proof that the warmth was staying where it belonged, inside. The cold snap broke as violently as it had arrived. On the 7th day, a warm southern wind brought the temperature soaring to 40 degrees Fahrenheit. The great thaw began, and with it, the reckoning. The half-inch of ice that had encased the county, now saturated with melting snow, created a load of incredible weight. That Saturday, the roof of the machine shed on the Jorgensen farm groaned, sagged, and then collapsed with a sound like thunder, crushing a new combine harvester. 2 other barns in the county suffered similar fates, their trusses failing under the unprecedented combination of ice and sodden snow. Word of the collapses spread through the phone lines. On Sunday afternoon, a small convoy of pickup trucks pulled into Eero Kelunky's lane. It was Burton Haviland, Dale Jorgensen, Les Miller, and a handful of other regulars from the auction cafe. They had come to see the expected disaster. They were certain that Eero's grass bunker, loaded with 40 tons of soil now saturated with ice and water, must have been the first to go. They got out of their trucks and stood in a silent group staring. The Quonset Quonset stood perfectly intact. But that wasn't what silenced them. Every other roof in sight, on their own barns, houses, and sheds, was still covered in a thick, white, ugly sheet of melting ice. The thaw had begun, but the sheer cold mass of the roofs kept the ice frozen solid. Eero's roof was different. It was a dark, rich brown, almost black, and it was steaming gently in the afternoon sun. The immense thermal mass that had held the heat in all winter was now working in reverse, slowly releasing its stored warmth and melting the ice layer from the bottom up. There was no ice sheet. There were only trickles of clean water running from the edges of the sod. And in the center, near the crown of the roof where the warmth was greatest, something impossible was happening. Pushing up through the dark soil were hundreds of tiny, brilliant green shoots, new grass, life in February. The men stood motionless. It was a sight that defied all their experience. Their own roofs were symbols of the winter's harshness, still clinging to the ice. Eero's roof was a declaration of spring, weeks early. Burton Haviland walked forward alone, his boots crunching in the wet snow. He didn't go to the door. He walked to the side of the curved wall, where the steel was exposed below the sod line. He pulled off his work glove. The men watched as he placed his bare palm flat against the cold rolled steel. He had built with this material his entire life. He knew exactly what it should feel like after a week at minus 25 degrees Fahrenheit, a biting, painful cold that would numb his hand in seconds. But it wasn't. The steel was just cool, neutral. All the killing cold he expected to feel was gone, held at bay by the simple earth above. He pressed his hand harder, as if trying to understand the physics through his skin. He then looked up at the impossible green shoots against the blue sky, his face a mixture of awe and disbelief. He had spent a lifetime fighting the cold, and this old man had simply absorbed it. He finally turned to face the others, then looked at Eero, who was watching quietly from his doorway. Burton's voice was raspy. "You didn't build a roof, Eero," he said, loud enough for everyone to hear. "You built a season." Eero Quonset just nodded. "Keeps the heat," he said. The story of the green roof that defied the great ice storm became a local legend. That spring, 2 of the men who had been in the convoy that day came to ask Eero for his help. They both had Quonsets they used for workshops, and the propane bills were draining them. Eero didn't sell them plans or offer advice from a distance. He went to their land, showed them how to cut the sod, how to layer the bark and gravel, how to lay the first course upside down. He worked alongside them, sharing the knowledge not with words, but with his hands. Vernon Reese became the innovation's unlikely evangelist. At every farm he visited, the propane man would tell the story of the Quonset place. He had the numbers to back it up. He laid his logbooks out on the counter at the co-op. "Look here," he'd say, tracing the lines with his finger. "Eero used 450 gallons for the whole winter. A Quonset the same size, over on the Miller place, they burned through 1,100 gallons. He saved 60%. Money spoke a language everyone on the prairie understood. That year, an article appeared in the Grand Forks Herald, a small human interest story with a picture of Eero and Alma standing proudly in front of their living green home. Eero's sod-capped Quonset was a throwback, an echo of an ancient Scandinavian building tradition, but it was also a precursor. Without knowing the modern terms, he had built a structure that perfectly embodied the principles of today's green building movement. His roof was a living roof, a concept now employed by high-end architects on urban skyscrapers to manage stormwater and reduce heating and cooling loads. His use of the Earth's thermal mass to regulate temperature is the foundational principle of passive solar and earth-sheltered home design. He had created a high-performance, energy-efficient home using the cheapest, most abundant local materials: dirt, gravel, and grass. It was a solution that anticipated the energy crises and ecological concerns of a future he would not live to see. By 1994, Eero had been gone for 5 years, and Alma was living with her son's family in Fargo. But his legacy was written on the landscape of Trail County. 5 other sod-roofed Quonsets now stood, their green curves unmistakable against the flat horizon, each one a testament to the old beet hauler's quiet wisdom. One autumn afternoon, a pickup truck pulled into the driveway of Eero's grandson, who now farmed the original 10 acres, plus 100 more. An elderly, stooped man got out. It was Burton Haviland, long retired. He walked slowly to the door and asked the young man if he still had his grandfather's drawings for the roof. The grandson, wary, asked why. "My workshop," Burton said, his voice quiet. "The wind, the propane bills. I want to insulate it properly." He pulled a worn leather wallet from his pocket. "I'd like to buy a copy of the plans." It was a quiet transaction, the kind that happens when a lifetime of experience finally outweighs a lifetime of pride. Burton Haviland had spent his career mastering the right way to build with new materials, with steel and screws and caulking guns. It took him nearly 20 years to fully appreciate the value of a method 1,000 years old, a method that worked with the forces of nature instead of fighting them. The old ways had survived not because they were quaint or nostalgic, but because they solved problems that pride never could. If you found this story of ingenuity and quiet wisdom valuable, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel for more stories like it. We believe the past has profound lessons for our present, and your support helps us bring them to light. What other old ways do you think hold forgotten solutions for modern problems? Let us know in the comments below. Disclaimer: this video presents a historically inspired reconstruction for educational and storytelling purposes. The characters, names, and specific events depicted are fictional, but the building techniques and scientific principles are based on real historical practices. Anyone attempting to apply these or similar techniques to modern structures should consult with qualified professionals and adhere to all current building codes, safety guidelines, and local regulations. This content does not constitute professional, technical, or legal advice.